Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in China because things are continuing to get worse. This chart shows the year on year movement in exports for China, and obviously, exports are the lifeblood of the Chinese economy. That's what China does. It makes things and then it exports them all around the world. And as you can see, the latest figures for October 25 show that year on year exports fell by 1.1%. And that compared to an increase of 8.3% in September. So that is a huge swing of more than 9%. And as you can see, October was the only month apart from February where China has seen a reduction in its exports. And in February, obviously, that was the month following Donald Trump being appointed as the president. He took over on the 20th. And that's one of the reasons why exports fell in that month, because Chinese companies come under a lot of scrutiny at that point. And so Chinese companies had actually been front loading a lot of their exports into the USA prior to that. But what we're seeing here is a genuine slowdown in exports. And that's clearly going to be really bad news for China because lots of companies in China are geared up for the export market. So this isn't a chart just showing what's happening with the USA. This is showing exports across the board. The USA is the single biggest market for Chinese companies. In 2024, Chinese businesses exported over $450 billion worth of goods to the USA alone. But this is actually showing exports for all countries. And it is a big concern that exports fell by 1.1% in October. And if we look at what's going on with imports, and the reason why I'm showing you imports is because it tells us what Chinese companies are planning further down the road, because a lot of Chinese businesses import raw materials, which they then use in their manufacturing processes before they finish making things and then export them. So it's basically like a forward order book for exports. And you can see that in October, imports only rose by 1%, and that compared with 7.3% in September. And if you look at the last 12 months, you can see that imports have really been struggling. And in 5 of the last 12 months, imports have actually fallen. So we're not seeing a big gearing up here for Chinese businesses. They're not planning to make up the problems in exports in future months. In fact, it's the opposite of that. When imports are only sitting at 1%, that tells us that there's not going to be a big surge in exports anytime soon. Now, if we have a look at what's going on with producer prices, because this is really critical for what's happening with Chinese businesses. So producer prices are basically also known as factory gate prices. It's the price of a product when it leaves a factory in China. And this chart shows the movements in producer prices over the past 12 months. And the scale on the right-hand side here starts at 0% and goes down to minus 4% at the bottom. And what you can see clearly is that in every single one of the last 12 months, producer prices have been falling. And in October, they fell by 2.1%. Now, that was a little bit better than what Chinese businesses had encountered in July, August, and September. But it's still a year-on-year fall of 2.1%. So what that means is that anything that's being produced in China today is being sold on the shelves for 2.1% less than it was this time last year. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 5 years, you can see that Chinese producer prices have actually been falling since October 2022. So in every single one of the last 36 months, companies in China have seen the price of their products falling. And this is obviously an absolute disaster because when you think about the costs of a business, you've got to pay all of your people. Well, wages have been going up in China over the past 3 years, so they're paying more to their staff. You've got to pay for your buildings, so you have to pay things like rent and fuel costs and electricity and any taxes that are charged on the local area. So all of those costs have been going up, as have raw material costs. So the price of things like steel and anything that you're using in your manufacturing process have all gone up. But unfortunately, the actual price of your products is going down. So what that means is that Chinese companies are being squeezed in terms of their profit margins. And lots of Chinese businesses are now making losses. And I'm working on a separate video to go through the details of which companies are making losses and to look at the extent of those losses. So please look out for that coming out soon. But what we're seeing here is really bad news for Chinese companies because they simply can't pass on any of their cost increases in terms of increased price of their products. And if we have a look at what's happening with inflation in China, general prices, this chart shows the movement over the past 12 months. And the scale on the right-hand side here goes from plus 0.8% at the top to minus 1% at the bottom. And what this chart shows is that in 6 out of the last 9 months, China has actually experienced deflation. Prices have been going down. Now, in October, there was a slight reversal of the trend. Prices rose by 0.2%. Now, that is minuscule. If you were given a 0.2% pay rise at work, I'm not sure you'd be overwhelmingly happy with that. That's basically lost in the roundings. And that 0.2% in October was more than offset by a fall of 0.3% in September, 0.4% in August. And if we carry on going back, in July, prices were flat. In June, there was a 0.1% increase. May, there's a 0.1% fall, as there was in April and March. And in February, they were down by 0.7%. So when you look at the cumulative impact since February, prices are down significantly. So that's good news if you're a consumer because it's nice to pay less for your goods. But it's really bad news if you're a company in China because you've got the same impact that you've got in the overseas market happening at home. And if we have a look at what's been happening with retail sales, so this is how much Chinese people are spending at the stores. This chart shows the movement over the last 12 months, the month-on-month movement. And you can see that in the last 4 months, things have gone really badly for Chinese businesses. In June, prices were down by 0.3%. In July, they were down by 0.1%. There was a slight bounce back in August when they rose by 0.25%. But in September, they've come down again by just under 0.2%. And the trend here is really worrying from Chinese businesses' perspective. And if we have a look at what all of this means for China's GDP, this chart shows the quarterly movement in GDP over the past 3 years. In the first quarter of 2025, GDP grew by 1.2%. In the second quarter, it only grew by 1%. And in the third quarter, ending in September 25, it grew by 1.1%. So these are the quarterly movements. And the reason why this is important is because China has targeted a growth rate for the full 12 months of 2025 of 5%. So it needs each quarter to be growing by at least 1.25% to hit that 5% target. But as you can see, 1.2, 1 and 1.1 are below the required level. And so it's extremely likely that China is going to miss its 5% growth target for 2025, especially when you take into account the fact that things are getting worse right now. And the trade relationship between the USA and China isn't going very well at the moment. Donald Trump has imposed a lot of different tariffs on China. It's hard to keep track on where those tariffs are. They've been up at 100%, they've been down at 30%. We're currently seeing some form of negotiations going on. But in the meantime, whilst all of those negotiations have been happening, higher tariffs have been applied against all Chinese imports. So imports into the USA are definitely down in 2025 compared to where they were in 2024 before Donald Trump became president and all of these new tariffs were imposed. So this is bad news for China in its biggest single market. But as we saw earlier, China's exports are also down in October across the world, so not just in the USA. And that'll represent bad news for all of those companies who are seeing their factory gate prices constantly going down. So they're making less profit. They will be contributing less to the Chinese economy. They'll be paying less tax. And so GDP is very likely to miss that 5% target for the rest of 2025. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's been going on in the Chinese economy for a long period of time. And 2025 has proved to be a really difficult year. Since Donald Trump took over as the president of the USA, he's been targeting Chinese imports. He's hit all of those imports with higher tariffs. They might be 30%, they might be 40%, they could be 100%. Nobody really knows what's going on with the tariffs because things change on a daily basis. But what we do know is that the price of all Chinese imports in the USA is now materially higher than it was this time last year. And that's impacting on both demand for Chinese products and also the profitability of Chinese exports into the USA, because Chinese companies have been encouraged to reduce their prices to absorb some of the impact of those tariffs. And that has happened to a certain extent, not across the board. Chinese companies haven't swallowed the full amount of the tariff, but they have seen some reduction in the sales price. So that's affecting the factory gate prices. And we talked about that earlier in the video. Factory gate prices have now been falling for more than 3 years in China, since October 2022. And obviously, that's devastating if you're running a business and you're constantly having to cut your sales price, because unless all of your costs are going down, you're losing profitability. And that's what's happening, because costs have been going up in the last 3 years, sales prices are going down, and so profit margins have been squeezed to the point where many companies in China, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies in China are possibly making losses right now. I'm covering that in a future video, so please watch out for that coming out soon. But what we're seeing is Chinese companies are struggling right now, and this is now feeding through into the general environment. So we're seeing sales prices going down across the board. Inflation is struggling to get into positive territory. China has got lots of deflation going on right now, and I'm covering that in that video as well. So please check out that when it does come out. But the bottom line for China is that if its companies are struggling to make exports, the home market is weak because consumers aren't actually prepared to pay more for products. They've got used to this falling prices on the shelves. So that's great news if you're a consumer, but not great news if you're a company trying to sell things at a profit. So the falling profitability of the companies is now feeding through in terms of slower growth in GDP. China is struggling to be able to replace its lost sales in the USA with other markets around the world, because other economies are also facing the same issues. They're wanting to cut back on Chinese imports. We talked recently about the fact that Chinese electric vehicles have been hit with tariffs in many different economies, and lots of other products are now under the microscope. There are questions raised as to whether China has been subsidizing a lot of its industries to enable them to have much lower prices than overseas competitors. And so different economies around the world are imposing tariffs to try to offset that. So all of this is really bad news for Chinese companies and Chinese GDP. And as we saw, the GDP figures in the first 3 quarters of 2025 do not support a growth rate of 5% for the full year. So it will be a miracle if China is able to deliver that 5% GDP growth. It's very unlikely to happen. And if it doesn't, then that's going to seriously impact on the Chinese economy, because it's been geared up to hit that 5% target for the past few years. If it doesn't, then the Chinese authorities are going to have to do something to try to stimulate the economy. But they've been trying that for the last 12 to 18 months. And as you'll know, if you follow the channel, the driver of growth in the Chinese economy over the past 25 years has been the property sector. That was really booming for a long period of time. Property was a no-risk gamble. You put your money in, it went up in price and value, and everybody felt more wealthy. But over the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen that situation entirely turned on its head. Lots of the big property developers have now gone bust. They can't get access to any more debt. They've been fueling their growth by taking on more and more borrowing. Unfortunately, the rug was pulled by the Chinese authorities. So companies like Evergrande no longer exist. They've disappeared. Lots of consumers in China lost money because they'd been buying these apartments off plan, putting down large deposits, in some cases paying the full amount of the build before it actually been constructed. Some of those apartments have never actually seen the light of day. They never got to the construction stage. So lots of people in China are either sitting on losses or have lost a lot of money in the market. So the property market is still on its knees. It's unlikely to recover. And China really needs its manufacturing businesses to step in and fill that void. But unfortunately, the manufacturing sector is now also struggling because lots of these companies are making losses. They can't increase their sales prices. They've got higher costs. So they're all struggling. and they're struggling to contribute to GDP. And overall, China is in a really difficult situation now. And it will be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of months through the end of 2025, what the final GDP growth figure comes in at, and what China can do to try to turn this messy story around. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, I really appreciate that gesture of kindness. Thank you so much. And if you've signed up as a patron, a YouTube member, or buy me a coffee member, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.